been superstitious about the first year, and the second, the third, and the fourth, and so on.
During his years on Bonanza, Dan Blocker hardly had time for his family. That's exactly how his son Dirk describes it today. Honest, a little bittersweet, and still surprisingly raw after all these years.
I'm Dan Blocker. Back in the old days on the western frontier, this was a weapon.
You probably remember Blocker as Hoss Cartwright, the big, lovable guy with a goofy grin and a heart of gold, always galloping into some kind of trouble. On screen, he was warm and approachable, but behind that famous smile was a man who barely had time to catch his breath, let alone sit down for dinner with his kids. Dirk recalls that in the 1960s, they couldn't go anywhere, fairs, parks, ball games, without crowds surrounding their father. To America, Hoss Cartwright wasn't just a TV character, he was a national treasure. Kids ran up for hugs, adults lined up for handshakes, and everyone wanted that one special photo. Dan, always gracious, handled the attention with patience. He smiled, signed autographs, posed for pictures, and kept going. But for his kids, it was tough. That constant public pull stung. Blocker once admitted, "If you could take your family to Disneyland and actually enjoy the rides without getting mobbed, you were lucky." Moments like that were rare. Dan and his wife, Dolphia, raised their 4 kids, 2 sons and 2 daughters, in the San Fernando Valley. When Bonanza became a hit, they expanded their home, adding bedrooms, a game room, even a pool, but privacy was still elusive. Agents pushed him to move to Beverly Hills like the rest of Hollywood's elite, insisting the schools there were better. But Dan wasn't fooled. Better schools? More like more expensive schools with more stuck-up parents? He said. Dan wasn't interested in elite circles. "If the schools here are good enough for regular folks' kids, they're good enough for mine," he told a reporter once. And he meant it. He may have been a mountain of a man, 6 feet 4 inches and around 300 pounds, but Dan didn't want to act larger than life. He just wanted to be a dad, the kind who taught right from wrong and made sure bedtime was at 8 p.m. They even had a system. If you weren't asleep by 8, you were out of the 8 o'clock club for a whole week. It sounds silly, but it worked. The kids loved belonging to the club, loved the routine. Dolphia played the disciplinarian, while Dan was the soft one, the teddy bear of the house. He used to say they had a pretty good crew. But when your dad's Hoss Cartwright to millions of people, your home life gets complicated. His kids watched him fight off outlaws on TV, fall off horses, take bullets, and wrestle grown men with ease. To them, it didn't matter that it was all pretend. Dan tried to explain it was just acting. That didn't stop one of his daughters from bursting into tears during a dramatic scene. It was just a shoulder graze, but she rushed over, checked his head, and asked if he needed an aspirin. To them, he wasn't a TV star. He was dad. That's the part audiences never saw. They saw a cowboy, a hero, but they didn't see the man lying awake at night, wondering if he was missing his kids' best years. To understand how deeply that affected him, you've got to go back, way back, before Bonanza, before Hollywood, all the way to Texas. Dan Blocker was born in a tiny town called DeKalb in Bowie County, Texas. His parents, Ora Shack Blocker and Mary Arizona Blocker, ran a small grocery store in O'Donnell. No one would have guessed that this quiet Texan boy would become a television legend. But Dan was different. Even as a kid, he stood out, literally. By adulthood, he was a giant, broad-shouldered and gentle, with hands like dinner plates. People often missed the other side of him, the gentle giant who could break up a fight with a calm word. He attended Texas Military Institute, then moved between Hardin-Simmons University and Sul Ross State Teachers College, where he found 2 unexpected passions: football and theater. Yes, theater. The same man who once worked as a bar bouncer was also acting in college plays. He earned a degree in speech and drama, an unusual combo that made him unforgettable. Physically imposing, yet articulate and warm, Blocker left an impression wherever he went. After college, life took another sharp turn. Blocker served in the Korean War, not behind a desk, but on the front lines, boots in the mud. He rose to the rank of Sergeant in F Company, 2nd Battalion, 179th Infantry Regiment. He wasn't acting when he earned that Purple Heart. His medal collection was long: the National Defense Service Medal, the Korean Service Medal with 2 bronze stars, the Combat Infantryman Badge, and more. Before he ever played a hero on TV, Dan was one in real life. When he returned to civilian life, he didn't head straight for Hollywood. He taught school first, English and drama in Texas, New Mexico, and later in California. He wasn't just a fill-in. He was a real teacher, the kind 6th graders would later brag about when their teacher became a TV cowboy. It wasn't until 1958 that Blocker finally moved to Los Angeles with the intention of attending UCLA. Maybe more grad school, he thought. But fate had other plans. His first on-screen role? A goofy space goon in a Three Stooges short called Outer Space Jitters. He was billed as Don Blocker, and it was far from glamorous. But it was a start. From there, the roles piled up: Gunsmoke, Colt 45, The Rifleman, Zorro. Usually, he played silent tough guys or bar bouncers, small roles but memorable ones. Little by little, casting agents started to notice. Then, in 1959, everything changed. And this is where the story takes a turn, the cliffhanger moment when life would never be the same again. Dan got the role that defined his career, the one that made him a household name, and ultimately the role that would pull his family into the bright, often brutal glare of fame. But before we get into the behind-the-scenes drama of Bonanza, the rivalries, the friendships, the secrets Dirk Blocker is finally ready to reveal, we have to go back to that first day on set. Dan, dressed as Hoss Cartwright, stepped onto the Bonanza stage, looked around, and knew right then that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. NBC was gambling on a new kind of Western, not just guns and action, but family, heart, and humor. They needed someone for Hoss who was strong but lovable, intimidating but warm, someone who could wrestle a steer and cradle a puppy in the same breath. Dan Blocker was that man. When he walked into casting, 6 feet 4 inches, 300 pounds, he didn't storm in like a tough guy. He was calm, polite. His handshake was firm, his voice soft. That contrast stunned the casting team. They'd seen plenty of tough guys. They'd seen plenty of sweet guys. But one man who was both? That was Hoss Cartwright. And just like that, Dan landed the role that changed his life forever. Over the span of 13 years, Dan Blocker appeared in an incredible 415 episodes of Bonanza, making him one of the show's most featured cast members. The series itself aired from 1959 to 1972, becoming NBC's second longest-running Western at the time. At its height, Bonanza pulled in tens of millions of viewers every single week. But fans weren't just tuning in for the action. They were waiting specifically for Hossen cheers erupted when he entered a scene. They laughed at his clumsy lines. They trusted him. Here's what you might not know. Dan never treated Hoss like a cartoonish cowboy. Instead, he played him with purpose, guided by a quote that shaped his performance. "We only pass this way once." Every time he stepped into that role, he thought about kindness, about making a difference. And that honesty resonated, especially with children. Dan received hundreds of letters over the years, one from a young boy who simply wrote, "I wish you were my dad." That letter stuck with him, not because of fame or fortune, but because it proved what Hoss truly stood for: safety, loyalty, love. That letter made every exhausting shoot and every missed family dinner feel worth it. Even with Bonanza's massive success, Dan didn't just sit back. He kept pushing forward with other projects. In 1963, he starred in Come Blow Your Horn with Frank Sinatra. Then, in 1968, he took on a very different role as a tough guy in Lady in Cement, and audiences loved it. He could be intimidating when he wanted to be. He was even considered by Stanley Kubrick to play Major T.J. King Kong in Dr. Strangelove, the iconic role that ends with the character riding an atomic bomb. But Dan never got the chance to accept it. His agent turned it down before he even saw the script. Slim Pickens eventually got the part, but film buffs still wonder what might have been. Still, Blocker stayed busy. That same year, he led Something for a Lonely Man, playing a blacksmith starting a town from nothing, a heartfelt story that audiences adored. In 1970, he switched things up again, starring in The Cockeyed Cowboys of Calico County, this time as a shy, bumbling bachelor. The movie was packed with legendary names like Jim Backus, Mickey Rooney, and Jack Elam. But acting wasn't his only venture. Dan was building something bigger. In 1963, he became part owner of Bonanza Steakhouse, a restaurant chain. The pitch? Dan himself, appearing as Hoss Cartwright in ads, showing up at openings, shaking hands, signing autographs. The restaurant business took off. People believed in Hoss, and if Hoss said the steak was good, well, you trusted him. Family was central to Dan's life, and in 1964, his young son Dirk joined him on screen for the first time in a car commercial. It was a small moment professionally, but a huge one personally, just a father and son working side by side. For Dirk, that was one of his earliest memories, not the TV set, not the Western hats, but that quiet moment in front of the camera with his dad. Despite all this success, Dan stayed humble. He made lasting friendships on set, including with a then-upcoming director named Robert Altman. The two connected, and years later, Altman wanted Dan to star in The Long Goodbye. Tragically, before filming began, Dan passed away, and the role instead went to Sterling Hayden. Altman dedicated the movie to Dan's memory. By the early 70s, Bonanza was winding down. The audience was changing. TV itself was changing. But Dan kept showing up, still making the cast laugh between takes, still signing autographs for fans, still going home to his family in the San Fernando Valley. Yet behind the scenes, the toll was mounting. Dan had always been a large man, and the health risks associated with his weight began catching up with him. Even though he kept smiling and working, those closest to him noticed his struggle. Dirk would later recall those last years, the long days on set, the quiet evenings at home, and how those memories shaped him. What was life like for Dan Blocker away from the spotlight? What finally brought down the man everyone thought was unbreakable? Behind the cowboy hat and the easy smile was a man of deep conviction and quiet love for his family. Off camera, Dan was just Dad. He married Dolphia Parker, his college sweetheart from Sul Ross State University, and together they raised 4 children, daughters Dana Lynn and Deborah Lee, and sons David and Dirk. Every one of them grew up feeling their father's enormous love and presence. David would go on to become an Emmy-winning Hollywood producer, while Dirk followed his father's path into acting. Dan never bragged about his personal beliefs, but he stood firm in them. He was a proud Free Methodist, a Democrat, and didn't shy away from making his views public. He supported California Governor Pat Brown in 1966 and later lent his voice to presidential candidates Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey. Speaking out wasn't always the safest thing in Hollywood, but Dan didn't care. He believed in doing what was right, and he had fun too. Dan loved fast cars. He owned a rare 1965 Chevrolet Chevelle SS 396Z16 and even had a Huffaker Genie MK-10 race car nicknamed Vinegaroon that competed in real races like the Can-Am series. His passion for speed matched the larger-than-life energy people saw in him on screen, but none of that could stop what happened in 1972. At just 43 years old, Dan went in for what should have been a routine gallbladder surgery at Daniel Freeman Hospital in Los Angeles. A sudden, unexpected blood clot traveled to his lungs, causing a fatal pulmonary embolism. On May 13, 1972, the world lost Hoss Cartwright, and American television lost one of its kindest stars. For Bonanza, the loss was staggering. No show had ever written a major character's real-life death into its plot before, but they had no choice. Hoss's passing was acknowledged in the 14th and final season, though the details remained vague. Years later, in a spin-off, it was revealed. Hoss died trying to save someone else, a fitting ending for a character and a man defined by selflessness. Without Dan, Bonanza was never the same. Ratings declined. The magic felt different. Michael Landon, Dan's close friend and co-star, once admitted that whenever he needed to cry on camera, he just thought of Dan. That says it all. Dan was laid to rest in Woodman Cemetery in DeKalb, Texas, beside his family. No flashy memorial, just a plain marker. B. Dan D. Blocker. Honest, simple. Exactly how he would have wanted it. But Dan Blocker's legacy didn't disappear. Today, you'll find the Dan Blocker Room at the O'Donnell Heritage Museum in Texas. Dan Blocker Beach graces the coast of Malibu. Dan Blocker Avenue winds through Henderson, Nevada. His story is literally written into the landscape of America. And Dirk? Dirk carried that legacy with pride. After that first car commercial in 1964, Dirk worked steadily in TV. Little House on the Prairie, The X-Files, Matlock, Walker, Texas Ranger, Chips, and more. From 1976 to 1978, he had a key role in Ba Ba Black Sheep as Lieutenant Jerry Bragg. And after decades of hard work, he finally landed a breakout modern role as Detective Hitchcock in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which ran from 2013 to 2021. Dirk's career wasn't just about acting, though. He went back to school, earned his degree, and eventually became a teacher. In 2017, he published Master and the Little Monk, a children's book filled with the same quiet, emotional depth his father once brought to television. Now, at 67, Dirk Blocker is sharing the real story of his father. Not the polished TV biography, not the puff-piece magazine profiles, but the honest, human version. Dan Blocker wasn't just a TV cowboy. He was a father, a husband, a teacher, a veteran, a man who lived by his values and never let fame make him forget where he came from. So when you remember Hoss Cartwright, don't just picture the cowboy on Sunday night TV. Remember the father who made it home for bedtime stories, the war hero who stood tall without ever raising his voice, the actor who made America feel safe for one precious hour every week, and the son who, all these years later, is finally letting the world see the whole picture. Now you know the truth.